which leads us into something, a different type of topic here, but and it has to do with this floating crust up on top of the mantle. And it has to do with a theory that's called isostasy. Isostasy is probably something a lot of people have never heard of, unless I never heard of it until I took a geology course back in college. When I was in college, back to some people, like when the earth was cooling, that was a long time ago, but in geology we covered this and stuff, and I never thought much of it after that. But basically what it has to do with, the theory of isostasy, has to do with the crust of the earth floating on molten rock or magma underneath it. Just what we described. Just what we described. The crust of the earth floating, because it's solid, floating on a liquid molten rock layer called the mantle. Now, isostasy has to do with balance. And what it is, they have found out, and as I told you, the thickness of the crust varies in different places, from anywhere from like less than a kilometer to 80 kilometers. So it has quite a bit of variance. But why does it vary? Well, scientists wondered about this, and they came up with this theory that in places like where it goes up really high, the crust is really super thick, like where the Himalayas are, or the Alps, or the Andes Mountains, the Rocky Mountains, the crust, if it's that high, the crust must be thicker underneath to support all that weight. Since it's floating, it's got to have a large, deep part floating into the molten mantle underneath. Now, in places that it's not really high, say like the Midwest, or the floor of the oceans, the Atlantic or the Pacific or Indian Ocean, the floor is there, the crust isn't as thick, because it's much thinner there, there's not as much mass above it, so it doesn't have to be quite as thick. So in some areas it's thicker, in some areas it's thinner, and this whole thing is being balanced because it's floating on molten rock, on molten iron, this mantle. So it's floating on this, so it has to be balanced. And that it all is balanced like that is what we call the theory of isostasy. So scientists believe that this whole thing, having the crust being balanced on liquid, is how the earth is actually set up. And the thing is, this is in the Bible also. You see, the key to isostasy is the word balance. The mantle under the crust is molten and fluid, the crust is solid, and it floats in a balanced way. That's how this all works. And it is accomplished. Now, scientists aren't all in agreement on how this is done. There's three that I'm aware of major theories about how this all works, but the general theme is pretty much the same. That the higher the parts of the crust are, the deeper it penetrates into the mantle. Sort of just makes sense. The thinner crust doesn't need as deep of a base. So isostasy deals with balancing on the crust of the mantle. Now, I keep saying this over and over, and you might be saying, why does he keep repeating that isostasy deals with balance of the crust on the mantle? It's because that's what this theory is, and this is in the Bible. Now, where did this theory come from, first of all? Before we get into the Bible aspect, the theory of isostasy, according to my textbooks and stuff, dates back into the mid-1800s. Two different scientists, I don't think they were working together, but two different scientists sort of came up with the same idea. Sir George Biddle Airy was one, and the other one was John Henry Pratt, who was the other scientist. Now, today, scientists don't know exactly how this all works out. Like I said, there's different theories on it, but this is how they came up with or why they came up with this theory. And nearly all scientists today, nearly all scientists I'm aware of, every geologist I've ever talked to or ever sat in on a class on, they all agree that isostasy, this balancing act on the mantle, does exist. Now, with that, I got to tell you a fun story. Story time, story time. Pull up a bowl of popcorn, get a drink, hot chocolate, whatever. Push your chair aside, sit on the carpet, whatever floats your boat here. Oh, floats your boat. Sounds like isostasy. Anyway, back in 1999, I was doing a Bible study on the book of Isaiah. Now, forget everything I've just said at this point, dealing with the science thing. Let me just tell you about this fun story. I was sitting and studying the book of Isaiah, And as I do a Bible study, I do different types of Bible studies. Matter of fact, I teach different styles of Bible study, different methods. And on this one, I was going verse by verse and examining the ancient Hebrew in each one of the verses as I was going through it. So this took me over a year of going through Isaiah like this, because Isaiah is not no short book. It's a long book. But I was in 1999 doing this series and this study, and I came to a verse that I'm going to show you right now out of the English Standard Version. I'm going to show you this verse that hit me. I was in chapter 40 of the book of Isaiah, verse 12. This is what it says. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? Now, that's the verse. As I was reading this, I stopped and I contemplated for a moment. Wow, what's the key words that I just came across here? I started looking at these. I saw measured. I saw measure, two different words. I saw weighed. I saw mountains, scales, balance. And immediately as I'm sitting there, I just thought back, this sounds a lot like the theory of isostasy. So I reached over, I was sitting in my study, I reached over and I grabbed my old geology book, Principles of Geology, and I pulled this out and I looked up isostasy and I read it again. And then I pulled up some other geology books I have and earth science books, and I started reading this. And the more I read, the more excited I got. As I started then going in and looking at the actual Hebrew words that are being described here, my excitement started to overflow. I jumped up out of my chair. I still remember this to this day. Jumping up out of my chair, pacing back and forth, talking aloud. My gosh, the theory of isostasy is in the Bible. Oh my lands, this is just amazing. Now, so here we are. Let me just show you from those keywords alone what we're talking about. Now, we've already learned what the theory of isostasy is, dealing with balancing of the crust on liquid sea and stuff. So it's balancing. Now, the first word that comes across here is the word measured. In Hebrew, that's madad, which is a verb, and it means to literally measure or to survey something. So this verse is talking about something being measured, and it's talking about the earth. It's talking about the earth being measured or surveyed. Then it comes to another word, very similar in English, the word measure, but in Hebrew, it's the word shalish. And shalish is a noun. It's not a verb. It's a noun, which means to use a balance to measure something. So we see this in that verse. Then it uses the word weighed. Weighed is the Hebrew word shakal, which is a verb meaning to suspend on a balance, like an old tri-beam balance or something, or a double beam balance. You put something on the weights and you get it to weigh out like they used to do in ancient times. And even in labs, we still do this kind of thing today. If you don't have a digital balance, you still use the old-fashioned type with putting grams on one side. You have the exact same word for using a balance to measure something being used here to describe the earth. Then it uses the word scales, peles. That's a noun also. A noun for actually doing a balancing or a weighing. It's the device is what it is. It's not the noun for weighing. It's the actual balance or the scale that you use, like what they would use to measure. It actually has that word. And then it actually says again the word balance, mozen. That's a Hebrew word, which is another noun for a pair of scales or balances. Something is being balanced. Now, you take these words in the Hebrew or in the English or the Hebrew thing here, and you take a look at what these words are saying and what's going on. It's talking about the earth and the earth having sections being weighed in a balance. What's isostasy? Isostasy has to do with the same thing. Isaiah appears to be writing about this theory that today in modern science we call isostasy. And I was like, okay, Michael, calm down. I went to work while I was working at a Christian camp at the time right then. I just started, and I remember going up and talking to two people up in the office, telling them what I just discovered. And they're like, I never heard of isostasy. So I had to explain isostasy to them, and as I explained it, they said, wow, that's what this verse seems to be talking about. I said, exactly. So I went back that evening, I went back home and I got to my study and I started pulling out commentaries and stuff and reading different commentaries. Now remember, a commentary is just one or two biblical scholars or pastors or whatever giving you their opinion of what the verses are. And I have many commentaries, as you can see. I have quite a few. Some are one author, some are very numerous. We have Warren Wiersbe's set here. This is Matthew Poole, one of my favorites. Then you get some that are different, numerous people doing them. And I started pulling many of my commentaries out, looking up this verse, and they too, some of them, actually quite a few Bible scholars, particularly ones that were very, very understanding and knowledgeable of the ancient language of Hebrew, they also said in their commentaries about isostasy. Let me give you an example for one. The John Macarthur commentary. Now, this one came out after my discovery on this, because this was in 1999. John Macarthur's one-volume commentary. I have a copy of it right here. His one-volume commentary. It says this concerning this verse. Let me quote it to you right out of here. And it says, quote, "God alone has power to create the physical universe and the earth in perfect balance, weighing mountains and seas perfectly, so that the earth moves perfectly in space. This matter of the amazing balance of our planet is called the science of isostasy," unquote. And he's not the only one who mentioned this out of different commentaries that I came across. This is something that is, I'm not the only one who came up and saw this. A lot of people have seen this. A lot of Bible scholars who are familiar with the geology, science of geology, identify this also as isostasy. I don't think they're wrong, because the words that are used here are the same things that you find from the Bible, you find in a geology book. It's describing the same features. I just find this absolutely amazing. Did you? I mean, okay, you might have got too excited, have to jump up and down and stuff like I did. I understand that. So after you take a deep breath, now let's calm down and let's go to another branch of geology that is really interesting. And you know what? I've got a story for that one too. Yes, my whole life is full of stories.